They say when a man plants corn for the last time, he's not just sowing food, he's planting memory. In Dry Creek, Texas, a dusty little town tucked between sunburnt hills and forgotten roads, there lived a farmer who refused to give up. His name was Mr. Silas Harper. Though his bones creaked louder than his shovel, his faith still walked strong with him every sunrise. A widower for over 11 years, Mr. Silas lived alone on his small patch of land, accompanied only by an old gray horse named Dusty, his lifelong companion. There, among dry furrows and a wooden cross planted in front of the porch, he still spoke to God every morning. And he spoke to Mary, his late wife, as if her spirit lived in the breeze that stirred the brittle leaves. He had made a promise to keep alive the land they both once loved. Nowadays, the young folks are gone, tractors replaced hand tools, and land gets sold cheap to those in a rush. But Mr. Silas made a decision that would change how his story ended. He was going to plant one last crop of corn. His knees ached. The world had long forgotten him. But this planting wasn't for money or food. It was to fulfill a promise, and to prove that faith, like the land, can still bear fruit. Hello my friends, I'm Roger, your storyteller from the Country Life Rural Stories channel. Leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Our story today is The Last Corn, Between the Land, God, and an Old Horse. The sun hadn't yet peeked over the hills when Silas Harper rose from his bed. His joints cracked like old timber as he sat up. The loose flannel shirt hung from his narrow shoulders, and his weathered hands trembled slightly as he buttoned it. In the corner of the cabin, he lit a wood-burning stove and brewed his morning coffee, same as he had every day since Mary passed. By the fireplace, he lit a single candle in front of her photo and whispered a short prayer. Then he looked up to the ceiling and said softly, "Today I start, Mary. Today I do." Dusty, his old ash-gray horse, waited by the cabin door like always, silent, still, as if carved from stone. When he heard Silas's voice, one ear twitched and he gave a quiet whinny, like he too knew what the day meant. They'd seen floods, droughts, and all the hard years together. Silas stroked his mane gently and placed the worn saddle with slow, steady hands. "Let's go, partner. There's land to honor." The cornfield sat uphill, beside an old oak tree where Mary used to sit and stitch quilts in the afternoon sun. The ground was dry, cracked wide open like it had been crying for years. But Silas wasn't afraid. In his coat pocket, he carried a small cloth bundle of seeds, saved for years, just in case. They were seeds of hope and farewell. At the first furrow, he knelt. It wasn't just a motion, it was a prayer without words, a sacred ritual shared with the land that raised him. He used a sharpened stick to scratch a line in the soil. Every move was slow but sure. Dusty stood nearby under the oak, watching closely, like a guardian making sure things were done right. The first kernels dropped into the dirt like offerings. Silas planted each one with his fingers, as if burying tiny promises. He wasn't thinking about harvest or selling, just about Mary's voice echoing from the kitchen, about footsteps long gone. Every handful was a letter to the past, a whisper of love rooted in soil. "For you, sweetheart," he murmured. By mid-morning, sweat had soaked his hat. The sun bore down like judgment, but he didn't stop. Dusty watched from a distance with calm eyes. Every now and then, he'd approach to sniff Silas's back, as if checking he was still okay. Silas smiled through the fatigue. "You and me, Dusty, the last two stubborn fools." At noon, he rested under the oak and broke a piece of dry cornbread with some old cheese. As always, he gave half to the horse. They ate in silence while Silas stared up at the blank sky and wondered if the rain would come this year. But his faith didn't depend on clouds. It was born of loss, of labor, of a love that never faded. Deep in his chest, he believed God was still listening. Before heading back to the cabin, he looked one more time at the rows he'd sown. They were few, uneven, but honest. Nobody else was planting here. Maybe nobody ever would again. But that didn't matter. To Silas, that field was his altar, his goodbye, his legacy. He brushed Dusty's mane once more, and they made their slow way home, with heads held high and hearts at peace. By the next morning, the town's whispers reached Silas's ears. At Miller's General Store, over card games in the dusty square, folks were already talking about the crazy old man trying to plant corn in dead land. Some chuckled, others shook their heads with quiet pity. But none dared say it to his face, because even if they didn't understand his faith, they still respected the man. Silas had long learned to live among rumors. He wasn't looking for sympathy or approval. Every furrow he dug was a memory, a voice from the past. Those mornings when he and Mary, young and sunburned, planted side by side beneath that same relentless Texas sky. Now, only his shadow remained, and Dusty's, trudging silently by his side through the hills. Dusty seemed to understand it all. His legs were weak, his back curved from years of work, but he never left Silas's side. He walked beside him, hooves dragging slightly, sniffing at the freshly tilled soil. To Silas, that horse wasn't just a companion. He was a witness, a brother in arms, a living piece of history that refused to fade. One evening, while Silas worked the final corner of his field, a group of young men rode up on quarter horses. Sons of city men who'd bought land around Dry Creek just to flip it or build weekend getaways. They laughed loud, mocking him for planting corn. One of them, a cocky boy named Vic, dismounted and stomped over one of the rows. "Not even crows'll come for this trash," he sneered. Silas looked him in the eye. No anger, no fear. Then he knelt, replanted the crushed row, and whispered a prayer. Dignity doesn't always shout. Sometimes it kneels and plants again. Dusty snorted, agitated, sensing the tension. Silas placed a calming hand on his neck. There was no point in fighting ignorance. His battle wasn't with boys who mocked what they didn't understand. It was against time, forgetfulness, and the slow fading of the land's memory. A war fought in silence, but deeper than any brawl. When the boys rode off laughing, Silas remained. He took off his hat, wiped the sweat from his brow, and looked up at the sky. "You know why I keep going, Lord," he murmured. Then he bent down and went right back to planting, stubborn as ever, with that quiet sweetness that only those who truly love can carry. That night, in his cabin lit only by candles, Silas said his usual prayer. He didn't ask for miracles or riches. He only asked for strength to finish what he had started. Dusty lay curled at the door like a silent sentinel. And though the cold wind howled through the oak trees, inside that little wooden home, faith burned like a fire no storm could put out. The days started stretching longer, and every sunrise found Silas Harper bent over the earth, fulfilling his promise. His body didn't move like it used to. His back ached like rusted hinges, and his knees burned with each step. But in his mind, every seed he dropped into the soil was a word of love, a conversation with Mary, as if she were still listening somewhere beyond the clouds. Dusty stayed close through it all. Sometimes he grazed between the rows. Other times he simply stood nearby, watching like a loyal soldier beside his general. There were no medals, no trophies, but between man and horse lived a bond as old as the red clay hills. With every soft nicker and gentle stare, Dusty seemed to say, "I'm here. You're not alone." The land, dry and cracked at first, began to change. By the third week, small green shoots broke through the crust. Silas dropped to his knees when he saw them, tears welling in his eyes. He touched the tender leaves with shaking fingers. It wasn't just corn. It was life daring to grow where death had taken root. love rising in a place no one believed in anymore. Back in town, talk turned to quiet awe. Some still snickered behind their hands, but others started glancing out toward the Harper place with curiosity. Mrs. Petty, the old herbalist who lived near the church, said to anyone who'd listen, "When a righteous man talks to the land, it listens." And though few admitted it out loud, something in the air was shifting. One afternoon, as Silas cleared weeds beside Dusty, a barefoot boy approached from the edge of the road. Maybe 8 years old, wearing a ball cap torn at the bill. He watched in silence, wide-eyed, then asked shyly, "Mister, can I help you?" Silas smiled, a smile that didn't come from his lips, but from deep in his chest. "Sure thing, son. Good hands are always welcome here." From that day on, the boy, his name was Tommy, came by most afternoons. He didn't know much about farming, but he had heart and respect. 2 things school books don't teach. Dusty took to him quickly too, gave him a sniff, then let the boy rub his face. Soon, where once there had been only sweat and silence, now there was laughter and life. Silas wasn't a man of many words, but he taught by example. He showed Tommy how to draw straight furrows, how to shield roots from harsh winds, how to say thanks to the Lord before and after each day's work. Planting wasn't just a job, it was a sacred act. And with a boy and a horse at his side, Silas felt his promise to Mary growing stronger than ever. Each evening, the 3 of them, man, horse, and boy, would sit under the oak tree. They shared hard biscuits, dried cheese, and jars of cool well water. No fancy speeches, no need for noise. Just looking at that young corn rising in the field was enough. It said everything, that the land sometimes hears prayers whispered from a tired heart. Summer rolled in heavy, dragging clouds of dust and heat like a curtain across the sky. The sun turned brutal, a knife slicing through the dry fields. Silas watched his fragile corn shoots stand tall like tiny soldiers braving a war. Each day became a trial, of endurance, of faith, of flesh. Dusty suffered too. His thinning coat glistened with sweat, and every step grew slower. Still, he walked beside Silas, always beside him, through every furrow, every prayer. Neither said a word, but together they formed a kind of quiet defiance, 2 silhouettes against a merciless sun. Tommy kept coming, barefoot and grinning, even when the heat shimmered off the ground like fire. He carried buckets from the well, learned to water gently so the roots wouldn't drown, and talked to the corn as Silas had taught him. "You don't plant with your hands, son," Silas said one evening. "You plant with your soul." Then came something worse than drought. One night, locusts. A swarm like living smoke rolled in from the east. They descended as the sun dipped low, chewing, crawling, devouring. Silas and Tommy ran between the rows, banging old pans, waving branches, yelling at the buzzing cloud. Dusty whinnied in panic, circling the oak tree, eyes wide with fear. It was no use. For hours they fought, but it felt like throwing fists at the wind. When the night settled, silence fell, and so did the stalks. Leaves torn, stems gnawed. Silas dropped to the ground, covering his face in his hands. He wasn't just mourning the crop. He was mourning the memory, the promise, the ghost of Mary in every seed. Tommy sat beside him in the dirt. He didn't know what to say. He just rested one small hand on the old man's shoulder. Silas looked up at the stars, tears running into his beard. Yet in his eyes, something still burned. Not anger. Not despair. Faith. "It's all right, boy," he whispered. "If one seed's still breathing, we haven't lost." Back at the cabin, Silas lit every candle at the little altar. But he didn't pray for the corn. He gave thanks for the chance to fight. For him, life wasn't about wins or losses. It was about standing tall with dirt on your boots and dignity in your chest. And though the locusts still hummed outside, inside that weathered cabin, a man, a boy, and a horse held onto a light the world couldn't smother. The days that followed were quiet and hard. Silas and Tommy, under the punishing Texas sun, trimmed away the ruined parts of the stalks, trying to save what little remained. Each healthy plant was like a small victory, a miracle standing where nothing should have survived. Dusty, panting and slow, still followed close behind, his presence steady as ever. One evening, as they gathered dry branches to shield the rows, Tommy asked, "Why don't you just give up, Mr. Silas?" The old man paused, wiping sweat from his brow. He looked at the boy for a long moment before answering, "Because you don't quit when you're planting for the ones who ain't here anymore." And in those few words, everything was said, the grief, the love, the hope sown deep in that soil. That night, Silas dreamed of Mary. He saw her young again, sitting beneath the oak tree, needle in hand, wind playing with her hair. In the dream, she smiled and said, "Keep going, my love, keep planting." He woke with tears on his face, but also with strength. It wasn't time to stop. The altar in the cabin had changed. Next to the candles now stood a single dried corn cob from the previous year, saved as a relic. Every morning, Silas touched it before heading out, like a soldier kissing his badge. It reminded him, "I'm still here. I haven't forgotten." Back in town, things began to shift. Some folks now spoke differently about the Harper place. Mrs. Petty swore she could feel the land listening. Mr. Miller said he hadn't seen such stubborn green since before the big drought. People weren't saying it loud, but they were watching, and something like respect was growing. One Saturday, Tommy came running, excitement in his voice. "Rain's coming, Mr. Silas. It's gonna rain." Silas looked to the sky, still clear. But by late afternoon, clouds rolled up from the south like dark wings. The wind turned sweet with the smell of wet earth. Lightning cracked the sky like heaven's applause. When the first drops fell, Silas didn't run for cover. He stood in the middle of the field, hat off, letting the water soak him. Dusty lifted his head and gave a long, proud whinny. Tommy danced barefoot in the mud, laughing like only a child can when hope is real and falling from the sky. That night, as thunder rolled and rain tapped the roof, Silas lit just one candle at the altar. He didn't speak. He simply closed his eyes and let the tears fall with the rain still dripping from his hair. Because he understood, sometimes God's answers don't come loud or with lightning. Sometimes they come in drops, in roots, in silence that holds your heart like a promise. The rain wasn't much, but it was enough. In the days that followed, Silas Harper's cornfield turned green again, like a patch of hope stitched into the dusty landscape. Every stalk that stood upright was an answered prayer, a reply to every whisper he'd sent heavenward. Dusty now walked between the rows with a kind of pride, as if he too knew something holy had happened. Tommy started arriving early each morning, tools in hand and dirt under his fingernails. His energy lifted Silas's spirits. Though his body still ached, he smiled more often now. Together, they weeded, propped up weak plants, and sang old farm songs Silas had nearly forgotten. The earth, in return, gave back life, quietly, humbly, gratefully. One afternoon, resting beneath the old oak, Tommy asked, "Can we name the field?" Silas chuckled, then grew thoughtful. "Yeah, we'll call it Mary's Hope." The boy grinned and clapped. That evening, they carved a little wooden sign and planted it at the edge of the field. Now everyone who passed would know that patch of land had a soul. By late August, the first ears of corn began to show, plump, golden, glowing in the sun. Silas ran his fingers over them like sacred relics, remembering how Mary used to pick the best ones for church picnics. Each year was proof that love could grow again, even in soil that had been cracked by loss. The town, once distant, now paid attention. Old farmers stopped by the field, tipping their hats in quiet respect. They didn't say much, but their eyes said everything. They knew what it took to bring land back from the dead. Mr. Miller donated some burlap sacks for the harvest. Mrs. Petty brought a pot of stew and said, "For strength, Mr. Silas. You earned it." But not everyone came in peace. One evening, a landowner named Ross Jennings pulled up in a shiny truck. He stepped out in clean boots and offered Silas a wad of cash for the field. "Take it, Mr. Harper. You've done enough. Time to rest." Silas looked at him, calm and steady. "My rest is here, not away from it." Ross drove off grumbling threats. But Silas felt no fear. Real wealth didn't live in bank accounts. It lived in roots. And those roots had dug deep into his soul. No man could buy that. Not now. Not ever. That night, as he shared supper with Tommy and ran his fingers through Dusty's mane, Silas felt a peace he hadn't felt in years. The harvest wasn't finished. But in his heart, he knew, some promises aren't meant to be seen. They're meant to be lived, quietly, faithfully, beneath the stars. One early morning, while dew still clung to the corn leaves, Silas noticed Dusty wasn't waiting by the cabin door like always. Alarmed, he stepped outside and found the old horse lying under the oak tree, his breath shallow, his legs tucked awkwardly beneath him. Silas hurried to his side, heart pounding in his chest. Tommy, roused by a neighbor's barking dog, came running. "What's wrong, Mr. Silas?" he asked, pale and breathless. The old man didn't answer right away. He knelt beside Dusty, gently stroking the sweat-dampened neck. "It's time, son. Even the strongest hearts wear out someday," he said, voice breaking. There was no vet nearby. The closest one was hours away, and Dusty didn't have hours. So Silas did the only thing he knew how. He sat beside his oldest friend and sang a soft, cracked tune, an old hymn Mary used to hum in the kitchen. He whispered thanks between the verses. Thanks for the rides, the storms, the silence. Tommy stood nearby, tears slipping down his cheeks, understanding in the quiet way children sometimes do. He was witnessing something sacred, a goodbye deeper than words. Just before sunrise, Dusty let out one last long breath. Silas leaned in, closed the horse's eyes with hands tough from years in the fields, and rested his head against Dusty's still warm body. The pain was sharp, but it came with gratitude too. Few men are blessed to walk life with such a loyal companion. With Tommy's help, they dug a grave beneath the oak tree, where Dusty had spent so many peaceful afternoons. No speeches, no big ceremony, just a simple wooden cross made from fence posts, and Silas's old straw hat placed at the base. He scattered a handful of corn over the grave, like planting thanks in holy ground. The cabin felt emptier in the days that followed. The night seemed longer, and the wind that once brought whispers of hope now sounded like farewells. But Silas didn't fall into despair. Dusty wouldn't have wanted that. So every morning, he still walked to the field. He still prayed. He still talked to Mary. Tommy kept coming too. Quieter now, walking slower. Together, they watered the crops, pulled weeds, and checked every stalk. They didn't say much, but their hearts beat in sync, the rhythm of those who've loved and lost, but still believe. Because life, they were learning, is about planting anyway. And beneath the surface of that loss, something strong continued to grow. Dusty, though he no longer trotted beside them, lived on in every sprout, in every sunrise, in every lightning bolt that flashed across the open Texas sky. He had become part of the land, like Mary, like every soul who ever loved this hard life and didn't give up. Loyalty, now rooted in the soil. The cornfield ripened slowly, as if honoring the grief of its planter. Golden husks swayed in the breeze, and the rustling of dry leaves filled the air with a music only old farmers truly understand. Silas walked the rows gently, touching each ear of corn like a memory come back to life. Tommy was learning to recognize when the corn was ready, how to twist and pull with care. Each time he handed one to Silas, he looked for the old man's nod. A quiet nod meant everything: approval, trust, pride. They weren't just harvesting corn. They were gathering dreams, promises, and memories buried deep in that Texas soil. On the first official day of harvest, Silas wore his best white shirt, the one Mary had embroidered decades ago. It had yellowed with time, but to him, it was a banner of honor. He tied a red ribbon around Tommy's neck, a token of gratitude, and together they carried old baskets to the field, hearts full. Neighbors started to arrive, slowly at first. They stood at the edge of the property, unsure. But as the afternoon sun warmed the field, people came closer, offering hands, knives, wheelbarrows. The respect Silas had planted in silence was now blooming into action. The harvest no longer belonged to one man. It had become a town celebration of life. Mr. Miller brought an old radio and played bluegrass tunes that echoed through the corn. Mrs. Petty cooked up a big pot of stew and cornbread for everyone. Laughter and boots and voices filled the rows like a revival. And in every handshake, every shared bite, there was something unspoken, a town grateful for a man who never gave up. Before the day ended, Silas took Tommy by the hand and walked to Dusty's grave beneath the oak. Together, they placed a perfect golden ear on the fresh earth. Silas removed his hat and whispered, "Here you go, old friend, we did it." Tommy pressed 2 corn husks into a small cross and stuck it beside the grave. No fanfare, just love made visible. As the sun set, turning the sky to fire and gold, Silas looked out over the field. He didn't just see corn. He saw legacy. He saw a community reminded of who they were and where they came from. And that, he knew, was worth more than any market price. That night, under a sky full of stars, in his quiet cabin lit by candlelight, Silas knelt at the altar. He didn't ask for anything. He just gave thanks. Because sometimes the biggest miracle isn't what you reap, it's that you never stopped sowing. Weeks passed, and news of Silas Harper's miracle harvest spread beyond Dry Creek. Folks came from neighboring counties, some out of curiosity, others looking for something they couldn't name. And when they stepped onto that patch of land called Mary's Hope, they felt it, something sacred, something quiet. It wasn't just corn, it was living memory. Tommy, once running alone between the rows, now guided other kids who wanted to learn. He taught them just like Silas had taught him, patiently, with hands in the dirt and heart wide open. Beneath the old oak tree, he told stories of Mr. Silas and Dusty, of Mary's promise, and the rain that came when no one expected it. And just like that, the story began to take root in others. Silas still worked the field, but slower now. His body was giving way, though his eyes held a soft peace. He knew his time on earth was short, but also that he had planted something that wouldn't die with him. The real harvest wasn't in the baskets. It was in the people who changed. One morning, Tommy came running with big news. "The school wants to name the little plaza by the church after you, Mr. Silas. They're planning a celebration." The old man smiled and shook his head gently. "We don't plant for plaques, son. We plant because we believe." But in his eyes, there was gratitude too. He agreed to attend. Borrowing a neighbor's mule, he rode slowly into town, wearing his best shirt and his old hat. There were no speeches, no banners. Just clapping hands, soft music, and people reaching for him with respect. And at the center of it all, the memory of Mary, and the steady rhythm of Dusty's steps echoing in his heart. That night, back in the cabin, Silas wrote a letter by candlelight. It was short, barely a whisper on paper. He left it on the table for Tommy, asking him to care for Mary's hope. "The land isn't ours," it read. "We're just its keepers, and we must leave it better than we found it." That was his final planting, a legacy. A few mornings later, Silas passed quietly in his sleep, like an old tree falling without a sound, but with roots deep and wide. The entire town walked with his casket to the cemetery, laying him beside Mary. Tommy, tears steady on his face, stood tall and promised aloud, "I'll keep planting. I'll keep believing. I'll keep loving this land, just like you taught me." And so, under the blazing sun and the endless Texas wind, Mary's hope kept growing year after year. Every furrow, every golden ear whispered the same truth. A man once lived here who taught us that love and faith could bloom even in the driest, most forgotten places on earth. Some men don't make noise, but they leave roots behind. Silas Harper was one of them. He had no riches, no degrees, no children of his own. But he planted something far deeper than corn. He sowed a way of seeing the land, of speaking to God without words, of keeping promises even when the body begins to fail. His life was a quiet harvest. His death, a peaceful reaping. In Dry Creek, under the shade of the old oak tree, children still hear his story. They say that when the wind picks up at dusk, you can hear the faint hoofbeats of an old horse. And in the cornfields, some ears grow shaped like promises, tough, golden, full of memory. The patch of land called Mary's Hope still thrives, tended by new hands, but watered by the same faith. Because some promises don't die. Some loves root themselves in the soul and grow with the rain of remembrance. And as long as there's a seed buried with care, a loyal animal guarding the land, and a farmer's heart that believes without seeing, Silas Harper's last corn will keep growing in every one of us. We have reached the end of our story. Leave your like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel. See you next time.